All right, so in this video, we'll continue with the endocrine system, looking at pretty much how the endocrine system works and some different concepts surrounding that. So one of the big concepts with the endocrine system is something called a target cell. And if you just look at the word target cell, you know exactly what it is because of, the words target cell. This is where the hormone is going. Though hormones, think about hormones systematically circulating throughout the body. So you have an endocrine gland that releases a hormone. It doesn't just stay in the area that it's supposed to go, it goes throughout the whole body. However, only the cells with receptors for that hormone will be affected, and those are called the target cells. They have a specific receptor that is able to read that hormone. It will pick it up, and then that hormone will cause that cell to do some sort of thing. All right, whereas it doesn't cause any of the other cells to do anything. And so there are several things that a hormone can cause a cell to do. And I just have a small little list here. Just write a couple of things for each one. Nothing major here. I don't have a picture to go along with it, but it's not too hard to think about. Think about the way that a hormone can affect a cell. It can alter the plasma membrane, causing it to be more permeable to something. Think like a nerve cell. When a nerve cell gets affected by a neurotransmitter, for instance, it causes those gates to open and the ions to flood in. And so hormones can have that kind of effect on a cell membrane. It can cause it to get rid of things or take in things. It can stimulate the synthesis of enzymes. And so a cell receives information and it starts making a protein. All right. It can activate or deactivate those enzymes. And so in the same way, there's a bunch of enzymes being made, and another hormone can be sent that says stop making enzymes and turns those enzymes off. It can cause a cell to release its own hormone, and so kind of induce this secretion activity where it secretes another hormone. And it can just stimulate cells to begin reproducing or dividing. So it can stimulate mitosis. And so that's just a couple of things that hormones can do. There's a lot of things out there, and especially when you get into specific glands, but that's just a general overview. So how are hormones received by cells? It's really in one of two ways, and it depends on the chemical nature of the hormone. Here's a picture of how a steroid hormone is received. Steroids are nonpolar, meaning that they are water phobic or they are hydrophobic, but the cell membrane is largely also hydrophobic. And so a steroid hormone is able to pass directly through the cell membrane, and it is received on the inside of the cell. You see here, there's a receptor. Here's the cell membrane. The receptor for this hormone is on the inside. And so it's able to just pass right through, and it's still received by a receptor. And then though that receptor goes into the receptor turns on some sort of process that causes it to be received by the nucleus, and the nucleus usually elicits some sort of cellular response, and that cellular response is typically make a protein to do the thing, right? Well, another type of hormone is one that can't pass through that cell membrane because it's too big, because it has a charge. And so these are those water-soluble hormones, the peptide or the protein hormones that we talked about, the amino acid type hormones that we looked at in the last video. And so these have to be received directly on the cell membrane. It's kind of like if there's a knock at the door, the person doesn't get to just pass through the door. All right. They have to be received and let in. And so this type of hormone, these peptide hormone, which is just a fancy word for protein. So protein amino acid type hormones are received on the cell membrane, whereas steroid hormones get to pass directly through the cell. But both elicit the same kind of response. Notice the nucleus, its job is then to go and make a protein. All right, so let's look at this idea of hormone release. Hormones are typically controlled. There's a couple of exceptions to this, but are typically controlled on a negative feedback loop, whereas the hormone is released because there's some sort of signal that says release a hormone. It's typically there's some sort of negative signal, as you can see here. Maybe there's no more hormone in the system, or there's no more I'll use an example for if there's a parathyroid gland that controls calcium levels. Well, if the brain picks up on the fact that there's no calcium, then it will cause this release of a hormone. That is a negative feedback loop. And then once that calcium gets in there, then it will stop producing that hormone. And so it feeds back on itself. All right. And the body has a very narrow range of desirable things that it wants. Like the pH for the blood has to be between 7.3 and 7.4, really narrow range, for instance. And if it gets outside of that, there's something wrong. And so then the brain will sense that there's something wrong and cause the release of a hormone. Same with your blood sugar levels, your calcium levels, all these things. And they're all triggered by this sort of negative feedback. Now, there are a couple of hormones that work on positive feedback loops, and we'll look at those as well. And hormone release can be triggered by one of two things. It can be triggered by gland stimulation, like you see here in this picture. This thyroid gland is stimulating the hormone release, or it can be nervous system modulation, which we'll have this whole other look at that. So let's look at endocrine gland stimulus first. All right, so this can fit into 3 different categories here, and I'm just going to give you a quick definition of each. There's humoral, neural, and hormonal stimulus. Humoral basically just means fluid, all right? And so the best way to think about this is if there's changing blood levels. So when you think of humoral, think of the blood, the fluid in the body. If there's changing levels in the blood, like an ion or a nutrient or something like that, then it will cause the stimulation of the release of the hormone. I just gave you that example of the parathyroid gland, and that's what's shown in this picture. If there's a low concentration of thyroid or of calcium in the blood, then that causes the parathyroid glands to be told to release their hormone, which causes the bones or whatever to get rid of their calcium. And then once the brain picks up on the calcium, then it triggers that negative feedback. There's neural stimulus, which is when nerve fibers stimulate the release of a hormone. So directly action potentials, as you can see there, cause the release of a hormone. And then there is hormonal stimulus. Sorry, you can hear the phone ringing in the background. Just have to wait till that stops. All right. There's hormonal stimulus. And this is when hormones from another gland stimulate the release of hormones. So, good example of this is the hypothalamus releases a hormone, tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone, and then the pituitary gland can then tell another gland to release a hormone. And so you can see there's a pretty long chain, or there can be a long chain for this type of thing. And so this is endocrine gland stimuli is when it's being stimulated directly. Nervous system modulation has a little bit more to do with, think of the way the nervous system works, think of the thing we just talked about with the nervous system unit. And the nervous system can make adjustments to hormone levels as needed. All right, so can modify stimulation or inhibition of those endocrine glands. Great example of this is the fight or flight response. All right, you come under some sort of stress that initiates this fight or flight response, then the brain is going to stimulate a release of certain hormones in certain levels in order to cause that to occur. The adrenaline is going to get pumping. You've heard of this before, right? And it's going to, so the release of adrenaline is caused by this nervous system modulation. The eyes, the ears all sense danger, and so the brain says there's danger, tells the glands to turn on, and they do their thing. All right, a couple of more things here and we'll be done. So how do hormones interact with one another? Well, there are 3 different things we're going to look at here. Multiple hormones can act on the same target at the same time. And so one of them is called permissiveness. And I don't have a picture for all 3 of these, so you just have to write them down. Permissiveness is this idea where one hormone cannot exert its effects without another hormone being present, right? And so, good example of this is reproductive hormones need thyroid hormone to turn them on. So if the thyroid hormone is not present, the reproductive hormones will not do their thing either. So think about the thyroid hormones giving the reproductive hormones permission to work, if that makes sense. All right, the next one is called synergism. And synergism is where they work together. We've had this word in another unit with muscles, synergist muscles working together. So this is where more than one hormone produces the same effect. Just kind of think of it as like if you're trying to put out a fire, one bucket of water is great, 2 buckets of water is even better. And so the 2 buckets of water are synergizing, they're working together to put out the fire. And so good example of this is glucagon is a hormone released by the pancreas, and it causes the liver to release glucose. Well, epinephrine released by the adrenal glands also does this. So great example there. And then lastly is antagonism. That's what you see here in this picture. And antagonism is, think of antagonists in the muscle system. They work against each other. This is where the hormones oppose one another. Glucagon causes the release of sugar. Insulin causes sugar to be taken up. And so they work together to, well, I just said they work against each other. They work together to regulate blood sugar, but they do opposite things from one another. So they're on the same team. They just have opposite effects. And so that's the way to think about that.